The check was already written when Richard Vance slid it across the polished mahogany table. $200,000, a number large enough to buy silence from most men, and Daniel Reyes didn't even glance down at it. He looked Richard dead in the eye instead, and what he said next would leave a room full of the city's wealthiest people standing in absolute, uncomfortable silence. But that moment was still 6 months away. On the night this story actually begins, Daniel Reyes had exactly $61 in his checking account, a limping 7-year-old son bleeding from a scraped knee, and no idea that the woman stitching that knee up in Trauma Bay 3 was about to become the reason his entire life would change. Daniel was 37 years old, and grief, he had learned, didn't leave a man broken so much as it left him quiet. The kind of quiet that settled into the corners of a house and never fully lifted, no matter how much light you let in through the windows. His wife, Marisol, had died 2 years earlier, 11 months after a routine checkup found a mass no one expected, in a body that had seemed, until that appointment, perfectly, stubbornly healthy. She had fought it the way she fought everything, fiercely, with humor, with a stubborn refusal to let their son Eli see her scared. And she had lost anyway, on a gray Tuesday morning in March, with Daniel holding one hand and a rosary from her grandmother wrapped around the other. Eli had been 5. He was 7 now, old enough to remember his mother's laugh, but young enough that some mornings he forgot, for a few groggy seconds after waking, that she was gone, and Daniel had learned to brace himself for the particular kind of heartbreak that came from watching his son remember all over again. Before Marisol died, Daniel had been a structural engineer, a good one with his own small firm, 3 employees, and a client list that was finally, after years of scraping by, starting to include real commercial projects instead of just residential inspections. But grief and single fatherhood did not leave room for 80-hour weeks and unpredictable site visits across 3 counties. He had closed the firm 8 months after the funeral, quietly, without ceremony, and taken a steady, if far less prestigious, job as a construction site foreman. Reliable hours, no client dinners, home every night by 6 to make dinner and check homework and read one more chapter of whatever adventure book Eli was currently obsessed with. He had traded ambition for presence, and most days he told himself it was the right trade. Some nights, staring at the ceiling long after Eli had fallen asleep, he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. The lawsuit had come 18 months after Marisol's death, quiet and unglamorous the way most real tragedies are. Not a courtroom drama, but a folder of documents from a malpractice attorney who'd reviewed her case at a friend's urging and found something troubling in the timeline. A radiologist's report flagged as indeterminate, recommend follow-up in 6 months, that had somehow never been forwarded to her primary physician, a follow-up that never happened. 6 months that, in hindsight, might have mattered enormously. The insurance company's lawyers had moved fast once liability became clear, eager to settle before the story could attract the kind of attention that made juries generous. $800,000, contingent on a standard non-disclosure agreement that would have sealed every detail of what happened to Marisol, including from Eli himself for the rest of his life, unless a court someday compelled otherwise. Daniel had sat with that number for 3 sleepless nights, doing the math he never wanted to have to do. A paid-off mortgage, a college fund, a cushion against every terrifying what if a single father lay awake imagining, and had turned it down anyway, insisting instead on a settlement without the seal, 4 times smaller, so that Eli would never have to grow up wondering what secret his own father had agreed to keep from him about his mother's death. It was the hardest financial decision he had ever made, and even now, 2 years later, he had never once regretted it. He rarely spoke about any of it. Not the firm he'd closed, not the settlement he'd turned down, not the particular quiet grief of watching his son grow up 1 year further from remembering his mother's voice with each passing birthday. He simply did the work in front of him, whatever that work happened to be that day, and tried, harder than anyone watching him navigate a construction site each morning could have guessed, to build his son a life steady enough that the boy would never feel the ground shift beneath him the way Daniel's own had. He had $400 in savings the week Eli fell off the jungle gym at recess and split his knee open badly enough that the school nurse called an ambulance rather than risk it. Daniel met them at Grace Memorial Hospital's emergency department, still in his work boots and reflective vest, dust from the job site still on his hands, his heart hammering the entire drive over. That was where he met Dr. Claire Vance. Claire Vance was 34 years old, and she had spent most of her adult life trying to prove she hadn't gotten anywhere on her father's name. She was the only daughter of Richard Vance, founder and CEO of Vance Holdings, a real estate and infrastructure empire with its name on 19 office towers, 6 luxury residential developments, and one very large wing of the very hospital where Claire now worked 80-hour weeks as an emergency medicine attending, a fact that had followed her through every stage of her career like an unwanted shadow. She had gone to medical school under a different last name on her badge for the first 2 years of residency, just to see if anyone would treat her differently once they didn't know. They had. It had made her furious, and then it had made her determined, and eventually it had made her exceptional, in the specific, dogged way people become exceptional when they're trying to outrun an assumption. Her mother had died when Claire was 19, and her father, in the years since, had thrown himself into Vance Holdings with the particular intensity of a man who couldn't sit still long enough to feel anything else. He loved Claire, genuinely, deeply, but he loved her the way he loved his company, by trying to control every variable that might hurt her. He had opinions about her career, her apartment, her security detail, and, increasingly, as she edged toward her mid-30s without a husband on the horizon, about the kind of man he expected her to eventually bring home. That man, in Richard Vance's mind, looked a great deal like Richard Vance. Ambitious, moneyed, comfortable in a boardroom, capable of maintaining the kind of lifestyle he believed his daughter deserved. Eleanor Vance had died of a sudden cardiac event in the back of a car on the way to a hospital that, had traffic been lighter, or the diagnosis caught even a day earlier, might have saved her. A fact that had settled into 19-year-old Claire like a splinter she never fully worked free and had, more than any single conversation with a guidance counselor or any childhood dream, decided the entire shape of her career. She chose emergency medicine specifically, she'd told Daniel once, quietly, on one of their early dinners, because she never again wanted to be the helpless person in the back seat, watching someone she loved run out of time while the world outside the window kept moving exactly the same as always. It was the truest thing about her, and almost no one at Vance Holdings galas had ever bothered to ask her why she'd chosen medicine at all, let alone the answer underneath it. Claire had dated exactly that kind of man twice. Both times she had ended things within 4 months, quietly exhausted by conversations that revolved entirely around portfolios and golf memberships, and never once asked her what the worst night of her career had actually felt like. She was in her 9th hour of a 12-hour shift, running on coffee and adrenaline, when a construction worker in a dust-covered vest carried his sobbing 7-year-old son through the ambulance bay doors himself, having apparently outrun the paramedics to the building, and set the boy gently on the exam table with a tenderness that made 2 nurses glance up from their charts. "He fell off the jungle gym at school," the man said, breathless, his hands hovering over his son without quite touching him, the universal posture of a parent trying not to make things worse. "There's a lot of blood, but I don't think it's as bad as it looks. I wanted to be sure." Claire knelt down to Eli's eye level before she even looked at the wound. "Hey, buddy, I'm Dr. Claire. That looks like it hurt a lot. You want to tell me what happened, or should I guess it was a dragon?" Eli, through tears, managed a watery laugh. "It wasn't a dragon. It was the monkey bars. Monkey bars are basically dragons," Claire said solemnly, already reaching for gauze. "Way more dangerous. I've seen it happen 100 times. She glanced up at Daniel then, taking him in properly for the first time, the exhaustion in his eyes that clearly predated tonight by months, the careful, patient way he crouched beside his son's head, murmuring reassurance, the reflective vest with a name patch that read, D. Reyes, stitched slightly crooked, like someone had done it by hand, rather than had it professionally embroidered. "Dad, You can hold his hand. This is going to need a few stitches, but he's going to be completely fine." "Thank you," Daniel said, and something in his voice, raw, grateful, stretched thin, made Claire look at him a half-second longer than the moment strictly required. She stitched Eli's knee herself, 6 careful sutures, narrating each step to keep him distracted, asking him about his favorite dinosaur and his second favorite dinosaur, and whether monkey bars had officially been defeated forever. By the time she finished, Eli had stopped crying entirely and was solemnly informing her that velociraptors were, in fact, faster than people thought. "You're good with him," Daniel said quietly, once Eli had drifted into the particular boneless exhaustion that follows a child's crisis. "Really good. Occupational hazard of loving this job more than I probably should," Claire said, washing her hands at the sink, not quite looking at him. "You handled that well, too. A lot of parents panic in ways that make it harder on the kid. You didn't." "Had some practice," Daniel said, and something in the flatness of it told her not to ask what kind. Not yet. He came back 3 days later, not for himself, but with a box of pastries from the bakery near the job site, dropped off at the nurse's station with a note that simply said, "For the team that put my son back together. Thank you. Dr." He hadn't expected to see her. She happened to be walking past the station when the box arrived, recognized the handwriting from the discharge paperwork, and found herself smiling before she'd fully registered why. She texted the number listed on Eli's intake form that evening. A small professional violation of hospital etiquette she told herself was purely about following up on the stitches, and asked how the knee was healing. Daniel replied within minutes. "Healing, great. He's already back to terrorizing the monkey bars against my better judgment. Thank you again for everything." What began as a follow-up text became, over the following weeks, something neither of them quite named out loud. Coffee, ostensibly to discuss Eli's healing progress, that stretched 2 hours past any medically necessary conversation. A Saturday at the community park where Claire, off-duty and in jeans instead of scrubs for the first time either of them had seen, pushed Eli on a swing while Daniel watched with an expression she caught and pretended not to notice. A dinner, finally, just the two of them, Eli safely at his aunt's house for the night where Daniel told her about Marisol, carefully, haltingly, the way a man talks about something he's still learning how to carry, and Claire told him, in turn, about her mother, about the particular loneliness of growing up in a house with more rooms than warmth, about the exhausting work of being taken seriously as anything other than an heiress. "You don't act like someone's daughter," Daniel said, not unkindly, turning his water glass slowly on the table between them. "You act like someone who fought for every single thing she has." "I did," Claire said, and something in her chest loosened at being seen that clearly, that plainly, by someone who had absolutely nothing to gain by flattering her. "Most people either assume I didn't earn any of it, or they act like the money makes me untouchable. You're doing neither. I don't really care what your last name is," Daniel said simply. "I care that you knelt down to my son's eye level before you even looked at his knee." Claire didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand, calloused and rough from a decade of construction sites, and didn't let go for the rest of the meal. The weeks that followed built something neither of them rushed. Claire began showing up at Eli's Saturday soccer games, standing on the sidelines in jeans and a borrowed team scarf, cheering loud enough that Eli started scanning the crowd for her before every kickoff. She taught him on a lazy Sunday afternoon how to properly clean and bandage a scraped knee himself, so you don't need the emergency room every single time you fight the monkey bars. And Eli had taken to carrying a small first aid kit in his backpack ever since, proud of the responsibility in a way that made Daniel's chest ache with gratitude. Daniel, in turn, started showing up at Claire's apartment on her worst nights, the ones after a shift that ended in a code no one could bring back, the ones she used to weather alone with a bottle of wine and a locked door. He didn't try to fix those nights. He just sat with her on the floor of her kitchen, made her tea she rarely drank, and let her talk or not talk, whichever the night called for. "You don't have to perform strength for me," he told her once when she apologized for crying in front of him after losing a young patient. "I've done enough of my own falling apart to know it's not something you owe anybody an apology for." It was the small things that convinced Claire this was different from anything she'd known before. The way Daniel remembered, without being told twice, that she took her coffee black before noon and with cream after. The way he never once asked what her father's company was worth, or whether she'd inherit it, or any of the questions that had quietly ended her last two relationships before they'd even had the chance to become real. He asked, instead, what scared her, what she missed about her mother, whether she'd ever wanted kids of her own, and listened to every answer like it mattered more than anything else being said anywhere in the city that night. By the 5th month, Eli had started calling her Claire without prompting. No honorific, the easy familiarity of a child who has simply decided someone belongs. By the 6th, Daniel had stopped flinching, some mornings, when he reached instinctively for a second coffee mug out of habit and realized, for the first time in 2 years, that habit was pointing toward someone real again, rather than an absence he'd trained himself to expect. 6 months in, Daniel had never met Richard Vance, and Claire had begun quietly to dread the day he would. She knew her father. She knew the particular flavor of scrutiny he applied to anyone who got close to her, the background checks he'd had run. Discreetly, he believed, though Claire had known about all 3 of them, on both of her previous boyfriends before she'd even brought them home. She knew that a construction foreman with a modest apartment and a closed engineering firm in his employment history was, in her father's calculus, exactly the kind of variable he'd want to eliminate before it complicated his daughter's life, or worse, in his mind, his company's public image. She put off the introduction for as long as she reasonably could. But Vance Holdings' annual charity gala, a black-tie fundraiser for the Children's Hospital wing, held every year on the rooftop terrace of the company's flagship tower, 40 floors above the city, was not an event Claire could skip without raising questions she didn't want to answer yet. And she had decided, after 6 months of falling steadily, unmistakably in love with a man who braided his son's shoelaces into tiny, careful double knots every morning because he'd once read that kids felt more secure with routines after loss, that she was done hiding him. "You don't have to come," she told Daniel the week before, watching him iron a suit jacket he'd borrowed from his brother-in-law, his jaw tight with a nervousness she rarely saw on him. "I know galas aren't exactly your scene." "I want to meet your father," Daniel said. "Properly. Not sneaking around like I've got something to be ashamed of." He set the iron down and looked at her, steady in the way that had first made her trust him in a chaotic emergency room 6 months earlier. "I love you, Claire. I'm not going to hide that from anybody, including him." It was the first time either of them had said the word out loud. Claire crossed the small kitchen and kissed him before he could see how much it had undone her. The rooftop terrace of Vance Tower glittered that night the way old money always insisted on glittering. String lights woven through white orchid arrangements, a string quartet stationed near the elevator bank, servers moving through 300 guests with trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than Daniel made in a week. He stood at the edge of it in his borrowed suit, Claire's hand steady in his, feeling for the first time in years genuinely out of his depth. Not intimidated by the money exactly, but acutely aware that he had, without quite meaning to, stepped into a world with rules he'd never learned. Richard Vance found them within 20 minutes of their arrival. A tall, silver-haired man with the particular confidence of someone who had never once, in 30 years, walked into a room and wondered whether he belonged in it. "Claire." Richard kissed his daughter's cheek, then turned his gaze to Daniel with the swift, assessing look of a man conducting due diligence in real time. The suit, slightly ill-fitting through the shoulders, the hands, calloused in a way expensive moisturizer hadn't yet softened. The watch, a simple analog piece that had clearly cost under $200. "And you must be Daniel. Claire's mentioned you." "Mr. Vance." Daniel extended his hand, steady despite the churn in his stomach. "Thank you for having me. This is a beautiful event for a good cause. It usually is." Richard's handshake was firm, brief, evaluative. "Claire tells me you're in construction." I run site operations for a commercial contractor downtown, Daniel said. Structural engineering before that. I closed my own firm a couple years back. Family reasons. Family reasons, Richard repeated, something unreadable flickering across his face. Well, we'll have to catch up properly. Claire, darling, Congressman Hale just arrived and I promised him 5 minutes. And with that, he was gone, swallowed back into the crowd, leaving Daniel with the distinct uncomfortable sense of having been measured and found wanting in under 90 seconds. That went fine, Claire said, though her voice carried a tightness that suggested she didn't entirely believe it. That went like a man deciding whether I'm a problem he needs to solve, Daniel said quietly, and Claire didn't argue because she suspected he was right. The problem-solving came 40 minutes later, in a private study 1 floor below the terrace, a request delivered by a member of Richard's staff, framed as an invitation Daniel didn't feel he could decline. Mr. Vance would like a word. The room was all dark wood and old books, the kind of space designed to remind a visitor exactly how much smaller they were than the man who owned it. Richard was waiting by the window when Daniel entered. A folder closed on the desk beside him. 2 crystal glasses of untouched scotch sat out like props in a scene he'd rehearsed. "Sit, please," Richard said, gesturing at the chair across from him. Daniel remained standing. "I'll stand, if it's all the same. Claire's waiting for me upstairs." Richard's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly at the small refusal, but he pressed on. "I'll be direct, Mr. Reyes, because I respect a man who values his time, even if I'm not entirely sure yet what to make of the rest of him. My daughter is 34 years old. She is one of the finest emergency physicians in this city. She carries the Vance name into every room she walks into, and she has, historically, excellent judgment. Except, it seems, in matters of the heart, where she has a habit of falling for men who are entirely unequipped for the life she actually lives. With respect, sir, I think Claire's judgment is her own to trust," Daniel said evenly. "I'm sure you'd like to believe that." Richard opened the folder on the desk. A discreet, thorough background file, Daniel realized with a cold drop in his stomach, complete with his tax returns, his firm's closure paperwork, even, absurdly, Eli's school enrollment records. "You closed a promising engineering practice 2 years ago. You currently earn $41,000 a year overseeing other men's construction sites. You're raising a son alone on a foreman's salary in a 1-bedroom apartment on the East Side. I don't say any of this to insult you, Mr. Reyes. I say it because I think you already know it, and I think, somewhere underneath whatever genuine affection you may feel for my daughter, you also know exactly what her name and her money represent to a man in your position." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "You think I'm after her money." "I think," Richard said, sliding open a drawer and retrieving a checkbook, "that men rarely know their own motives as clearly as they believe they do. So I'm going to make this simple, and I'm going to make it generous, because I don't believe in doing things halfway." He uncapped a pen, wrote quickly, and slid the check across the desk. $200,000 made out to Daniel Reyes, the ink still glistening. "Take this. Move somewhere new, if you'd like. Start a firm again. Give your son a better school district, whatever you think a fresh start looks like. And end things with my daughter quietly, before this goes any further than a few dinners and a party invitation. She'll be hurt for a while. She'll recover. She always does. And you'll walk away from tonight considerably better off than you walked in." The room went very quiet. Somewhere above them, faintly, the string quartet was still playing. "You think writing a number on a piece of paper tells you something true about who I am?" Daniel said slowly, not yet reaching for the check, his voice low and controlled in a way that unsettled Richard more than shouting would have. "I've met men like you before, sir. Not billionaires exactly, but men who believe money is the most honest language there is, that everyone has a price, and the only real skill in life is figuring out where someone's number sits. I used to believe that too, a little, back before my wife got sick. Ambition does that to you, makes you fluent in exactly that language. And now, Richard asked, some genuine curiosity slipping through the practiced calm of his negotiation voice. "Now, I know some things don't have a price at all," Daniel said, "not because they're too expensive, because the whole concept doesn't apply to them. You can't buy back a year you missed with your kid. You can't buy the truth your son deserves about how his mother died, and you sure as hell can't buy whether or not I love your daughter, because that's not a transaction, Mr. Vance. That's just true, whether you write a check or not." Richard's expression flickered. Not quite doubt, not quite respect, something caught uncomfortably between the two. "Everyone has a price, Mr. Reyes. I've built an empire on that principle. I've never once been wrong about it." "You're about to be," Daniel said quietly. Daniel looked down at the check for a long moment. Not because he was tempted, Richard would realize only later, but because he was making absolutely sure his voice would come out steady before he used it. "Mr. Vance," Daniel said finally, "2 years ago, an insurance company offered my family a settlement 4 times this size after my wife's death. A wrongful diagnosis case, a real one, with real fault on their side. My lawyer told me to take it. My accountant told me to take it. Every practical instinct I had told me to take it, because I was terrified and grieving, and looking at a mortgage I didn't know how I'd cover alone. I turned it down anyway, because taking it meant signing away my son's right to ever know the full truth of what happened to his mother if he wanted to, someday, when he's old enough to ask. I decided a truth my son might need one day mattered more than a number that would have made my life easier for a while." He slid the check back across the desk, untouched. "So, no, sir. I'm not the kind of man $200,000 moves. I love your daughter. Not her name, not her money. Her. The way she got down on the floor to look my son in the eye before she even looked at his wound. The way she still calls her mother's old friends on her birthday every year because she doesn't want anyone to forget her. That's who I fell in love with. If she decides on her own that I'm not what she wants, I'll walk away with my dignity intact and never look back. But I'm not going to let you buy that decision for her. That's not yours to sell." He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at Richard, whose face had gone pale and utterly still. "For what it's worth, sir, I don't think you actually believe I'm a gold digger. I think you're scared of losing control over the one part of your life you can't run like a company. I understand that more than you'd guess. I just don't happen to think it gives you the right to write a check for my dignity." He walked out without waiting for a reply. What neither he nor Richard yet knew was that Claire, worried by how long the quiet word was taking, had followed a staff member's directions down to the study floor and arrived at the open door in time to hear the last third of it. The settlement, the refusal, the walk to the door, standing frozen in the hallway with her hand pressed over her mouth, tears she didn't bother to hide streaking silently down her face. Nor did either man know that 4 members of the catering staff, 2 board members who had stepped out for a private conversation of their own, and Richard's longtime executive assistant had all, at various points, drifted within earshot of the raised voices and the silence that followed, and that by the time Daniel emerged into the hallway and found Claire standing there, tears on her face, an unmistakable hush had rippled backward through the gala above them. The particular kind of silence that spreads through a room when everyone senses something has just happened, even if only a handful of people know exactly what. "You heard," Daniel said quietly when Claire didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Enough of it," she said, her voice thick. "Marisol's case. The settlement. You never told me that." "Wasn't something I brought up on a first date," Daniel said, attempting weakly a smile. Claire closed the distance between them and kissed him, hard, in the middle of the hallway, in full view of the gathering staff, not caring in the slightest who saw. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were bright and fierce. "I am so sorry. About all of it. My father had no right." "Your father's scared," Daniel said gently. "I get it. Doesn't make it right, but I get it." They returned to the terrace together, hand in hand, and if the room had gone quiet at the sound of Daniel's refusal an hour earlier, it went quieter still at the sight of Richard Vance's daughter walking back in publicly, visibly, unmistakably choosing the man her father had just tried to pay to disappear. Richard did not follow them back to the party. He remained in the study for nearly 20 minutes, alone, the untouched check still sitting on the desk where Daniel had left it. Staring at it the way a man stares at a puzzle he suddenly realized he's been solving wrong for years. He thought of his late wife, Eleanor, who had married him back when he was still just a mid-level developer with more ambition than money, and who used to tell him, gently, in the years before she died, that he mistook control for love more often than he realized. He thought of the $200,000 sitting untouched on his desk and of a man who had turned down 4 times that amount rather than trade away his son's future right to the truth. He thought, uncomfortably, that he had spent 30 years building an empire and had somehow never once in all that time been tested the way Daniel Reyes had just been tested. Quietly, privately, with no audience to reward the right answer, and passed. He was still sitting there, the scotch glasses untouched, when the fire alarm began to sound 40 minutes later. The rooftop terrace of Vance Tower had been renovated 18 months earlier. A rushed job, Daniel would later learn, pushed through under budget and behind the original engineering firm's recommended timeline in order to be ready for that year's gala. A load-bearing support column near the north edge of the terrace, weakened by a drainage issue no one had caught during the fast-tracked inspection, had been groaning under the combined weight of 300 guests, a full catering setup, and an unusually heavy ice sculpture display for the better part of the evening. At 9:47 p.m., with a sound like a gunshot, a section of decorative stone facing near the north railing cracked and gave way, and the terrace floor beneath it shuddered visibly enough that champagne glasses toppled across 4 tables and a woman near the edge screamed. Panic, in a crowd of 300 people 40 floors above the ground, moves fast and moves badly. Guests surged toward the single working elevator bank, a crush forming immediately, security shouting instructions no one could hear over the alarm and the rising din of fear. Claire grabbed Daniel's arm, her medical training kicking in even through her own fear. The stairwell exits are on the south side. People are all pushing north toward the elevators. That's exactly backwards. But Daniel wasn't listening to the crowd. He was staring at the cracked stone facing near the north railing, at the visible sag in the terrace floor beneath it, at the particular pattern of the crack radiating outward from a point that, to anyone without his training, meant nothing, and to him meant everything. "That's not surface damage," he said, already moving toward it against the flow of the panicked crowd. "That's a structural failure. If that column goes, it's not just that section of floor. It's potentially the load path for the entire north terrace." "Daniel, I need everyone off the north side now," he said, already shouting, already moving with the same calm, absolute authority Claire remembered from a chaotic emergency room 6 months earlier, when he'd carried his bleeding son through the ambulance doors himself rather than wait for paramedics. He grabbed a passing security guard by the arm. "Get everyone clear of this section, at least 30 feet back, and get me whoever's running building maintenance on comms right now. I need to know if there's an emergency shutoff for the terrace's water reclamation system. If that column's compromised by water damage, added weight from a burst line could bring the whole section down in minutes." The guard, recognizing something in Daniel's voice that cut through his own panic, obeyed instantly, radioing ahead. Within 90 seconds, Daniel had a floor plan pulled up on the guard's tablet, tracing the load paths from memory and instinct honed across a decade of structural work, directing a chain of increasingly deferential security staff and, eventually, the building's own night engineer, toward an access panel Daniel identified from 20 feet away as the isolation valve for exactly the water line he suspected. Richard arrived on the terrace, having sprinted up from the study the moment the alarm sounded, in time to see the man he had tried to pay off an hour earlier directing his own emergency response team with more competence than the building's actual safety staff had managed in the same span of time. He watched, frozen, as Daniel personally climbed over a velvet rope barrier, ignoring a security guard's half-hearted objection, to visually inspect the compromised column from a safer angle, calling out measurements and stress points to the night engineer like he'd designed the building himself. "The column's not going to fail catastrophically in the next few minutes if we get the weight off it now," Daniel called back, voice carrying clearly over the alarm. "But I want this entire section cleared and cordoned, and I want a structural engineer out here within the hour to assess before anyone's allowed back up. Right now, the priority is getting people to the south stairwell in an orderly line, not the elevators. Elevators lose power in a structural emergency protocol, and you'll have people trapped in the shafts." Midway through the evacuation, a second, sharper crack echoed from the compromised section, and the terrace floor dropped nearly an inch beneath the weight of the remaining ice sculpture display, sending a fresh wave of screams through the retreating crowd. Daniel didn't flinch. He was already moving toward the sound, waving off a security guard's attempt to pull him back. "That's the secondary support taking load it wasn't designed for. If that display shifts another few inches, it goes over the edge of the compromised section entirely, and I want zero chance of that happening with people still on this floor." He directed 2 catering staff to help him walk the massive ice sculpture stand, foot by careful foot, away from the weakened section himself, his borrowed dress shoes slipping once on the wet marble before he caught his balance. Claire's heart in her throat as she watched from the cordon line, unable to look away and unable, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to do anything to help beyond trust him completely. It took 11 minutes to clear the terrace safely, Daniel moving through the crowd the entire time with the same steady, reassuring presence he'd once used to calm a crying 7-year-old on an exam table. A hand on an elderly guest's elbow, a calm word to a sobbing young woman who'd lost her shoe in the crush, a firm, clear voice cutting through panic to redirect the flow of bodies toward the correct stairwell. Not one person was injured. The structural engineer who arrived within the hour, exactly as Daniel had requested, confirmed within minutes of her own inspection that Daniel's read on the failure had been essentially perfect. A drainage flaw from the rushed renovation, exactly where he'd identified it, and that his quick call to isolate the water line had almost certainly prevented a far more serious collapse. Richard Vance stood at the edge of the cordoned-off section long after the crowd had cleared, watching Daniel, jacket gone, borrowed suit shirt untucked and streaked with dust, sleeves rolled to the elbow, helped the night engineer secure a final barrier, and found himself, for the second time that night, utterly without words. The gala did not resume. Guests were escorted safely to the lobby. The fundraiser rescheduled with an apologetic press statement issued before midnight, and by the time the building had finally emptied, it was just Richard, Claire, and Daniel left on the mostly dark 40th floor, the string quartet's abandoned instruments still sitting on their stands near an evacuated bar cart. Richard approached slowly, and for the first time since Daniel had met him 3 hours earlier, he looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man who had genuinely, thoroughly reassessed something he'd believed with total confidence just that morning. "That renovation was pushed through 18 months ago against my head of construction's original timeline recommendation," Richard said quietly. "I approved the fast-tracking myself, overruled the engineer who wanted 6 more weeks." He looked at the cracked stone facing, then back at Daniel. "You saved 300 people from a mistake I made." "You didn't know," Daniel said. "That's what inspections are for. Nobody catches everything. You caught it in under 2 minutes from 30 feet away, in a room full of screaming people." Richard's voice was rough. "I offered you $200,000 an hour ago to disappear from my daughter's life. Tonight, you very possibly saved mine, and hers, and everyone else's on this floor, for free, without being asked, the same way you apparently do everything." He shook his head slowly. "I've spent 30 years believing I could measure a man's worth by a balance sheet. I don't think I've ever been more wrong about anything in my life." "Dad," Claire said quietly, moving to stand beside Daniel, her hand finding his without hesitation. "I'm not going to insult either of you by pretending an apology fixes what I said in that study," Richard said. "But I am sorry, Daniel. Genuinely. You were right about all of it. I was scared of losing control of the one thing in my life that was never mine to control in the first place." He extended his hand, the same evaluative handshake from 3 hours earlier now carrying an entirely different weight. I'd like the chance to actually get to know you. Properly, this time. Not through a background file." Daniel shook his hand. "I'd like that too, sir." The story broke by morning. Not through any press release, but through the sheer number of gala guests who had witnessed some piece of it firsthand and couldn't resist telling someone. Within 48 hours, a local news outlet ran a segment titled "The Construction Worker Who Saved a Billionaire's Gala," built almost entirely on second-hand accounts from caterers and board members, since Daniel himself declined every interview request that came through Claire's assistant. "I didn't do it to be on the news," he told her, turning down the fourth request that week. "I did it because it needed doing. That's the whole story." Eli, less camera-shy than his father, did agree to one brief interview outside their apartment building, informing a visibly charmed local reporter, with total seriousness, that his dad fixes broken things for a living, buildings and people both, a line that ended up clipped and shared online more widely than the entire rest of the segment combined. The following weeks were not without friction. Richard, true to a lifetime of habits not undone in a single evening, showed up twice at Daniel's job site unannounced. Once with a business proposal Daniel firmly declined, having no interest in being handed anything, and once simply to watch, from a respectful distance, as Daniel walked a crew of 6 through a foundation inspection with the same quiet authority he'd shown on the terrace. Claire, for her part, found herself fielding a fresh round of scrutiny from her father's circle, whispered questions about whether she was settling, pointed comments at follow-up events about Daniel's modest apartment, and discovered, to her own surprise, that she no longer cared even slightly what any of them thought. She had spent her whole life trying to prove she'd earned her place outside her father's shadow. Loving Daniel, she realized, wasn't a step backward from that fight. It was the first time anyone had ever wanted her without needing her to prove anything at all. 3 months later, Richard Vance stood in a modest apartment on the east side of the city, a place he would have driven past without a second glance a year earlier, helping Eli Reyes assemble a model bridge for a school science project while Daniel and Claire cooked dinner in the small kitchen a few feet away, laughing about something neither Richard nor Eli could quite hear. "You have to make the trusses triangles," Richard told the boy, with the same intensity he'd once reserved for boardroom negotiations. "Triangles distribute weight, squares just collapse. That's what my dad says," Eli said, matter of fact, gluing a support beam into place. "He used to build real buildings, you know. Before." "I know, buddy," Richard said, something soft and unfamiliar moving through his chest. "I know." Vance Holdings hired Daniel Reyes 6 weeks later, not as a favor and not quietly, but publicly, as the newly created head of structural integrity across the company's entire portfolio, a role Richard insisted, over Daniel's initial reluctance, existed because the near disaster on the terrace had proven beyond argument that the company needed exactly the kind of rigor Daniel brought to every square inch of a building. Daniel accepted on the condition that his hours would never again cost him a single dinner with his son, a condition Richard, to Claire's quiet astonishment, agreed to without hesitation. He proposed to Claire 5 months after that, on a Sunday morning, in the same small park where she had once pushed Eli on the swings in her off-duty jeans, kneeling on the same worn patch of grass with a ring he had paid for entirely with his own savings, refusing, gently but firmly, Richard's offer to help cover it. "This one's mine to give her," he'd told his future father-in-law. "Same as everything else that's mattered." Claire said yes before he'd even finished the question, laughing through tears, Eli whooping and cartwheeling across the grass beside them, having been the one, 3 weeks earlier, to help Daniel pick out the ring in the first place, solemnly vetoing the first 2 options as not sparkly enough for Claire. At the rescheduled gala 6 months after the first one, held this time on solid, freshly re-engineered ground with Daniel's own signature on the final inspection report, Richard Vance stood before the same 300 guests who had once watched a man refuse a check and then save their lives within the same hour, and raised a glass. "A year ago, I believed a man's worth could be measured by what he owned," he said, his eyes finding Daniel and Claire, standing together near the back of the room. Eli asleep against his father's shoulder despite the late hour. I've since learned it's better measured by what he refuses to sell. To the man who turned down my money and then saved my building, my daughter, and frankly, my understanding of what actually matters. Thank you. You didn't just leave that room silent that night. You left me changed. The room rose in applause, and Daniel, uncomfortable as ever with attention he hadn't sought, simply held his sleeping son a little closer and let himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, feel entirely, unambiguously at peace. Some men build empires by controlling everything around them. Daniel Reyes built a life by refusing to be bought, and in the end, that refusal was worth more than any check anyone ever tried to hand him. If this story moved you, about integrity, quiet strength, and the kind of man money can never actually buy, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs the reminder that some things simply aren't for sale. Subscribe for more powerful, heartfelt stories delivered straight to your feed every single week.